The night settles softly around us now, and with it comes a story that moves like a distant shadow across the fields of history. This is not a tale of thunder and noise, but one of quiet turns that reshaped countless lives in whispers rather than screams. In the rustle of palm leaves and the slow breath of warm air over Cambodia's plains, a young boy once dreamed of a simple life, never knowing how deeply his name would one day echo through suffering and sorrow. Tonight, we drift gently into that story, not to glorify the darkness within it, but to understand how fragile the path of a human soul can be, and how silence itself can become a witness. As your body unwinds and your breathing slows, let the weight of the day lift away, and allow history to unfold like a distant lantern in the fog. If these words carry you closer to rest, let this quiet space stay with you tonight. Let this channel become a familiar companion in the dark, where stories move slowly and sleep is never rushed. Beneath the wide Cambodian sky, where the air once carried the scent of wet earth and ripening rice, a child moved through the early hours of his life with quiet footsteps and unremarkable dreams. Saloth Sar was not born into fire or into fame. He entered the world in softness, cradled by routines that had existed long before his name was ever spoken. Mornings arrived with the low chant of monks drifting from nearby temples, their voices floating like mist through bamboo walls. Evenings settled with the hum of insects and the soft clatter of bowls as families gathered for simple meals. In this world, the future felt far away, and history had not yet chosen him. He learned early how to be still, how to watch more than he spoke, how to listen to the earth itself as it shifted beneath bare feet. The village did not demand ambition. It asked only for patience, for rhythm, for the quiet trust that tomorrow would resemble today. His family was neither wealthy nor desperate, simply rooted, like so many others, in the slow cycles of planting and harvest. There was comfort in that sameness. The days rose and fell like the tide, each one gently erasing the last. As a boy, he was said to be calm, even gentle, not the loudest in laughter, not the quickest in anger. He carried water, swept floors, learned respect through repetition rather than instruction. In the shade of mango trees, children played at being warriors and kings, but even their games dissolved quickly back into dust and breathless laughter. Nothing in these early years hinted at the vast darkness that would one day follow his name like a long, cold shadow. And yet, even in the quietest places, the world beyond the horizon is always moving. Cambodia in those years lived beneath layers of invisible tension. Old power structures still lingered like ghosts in government halls. Foreign influence drifted in through trade, through schools, through whispered rumors of change. The village itself felt untouched, but threads of the wider world were already weaving into young minds, subtle and unseen. The idea that life could be different, sharper, grander, more commanding, began to take root in places where once only survival had lived. As Saloth Sar grew older, the call of education carried him beyond the edges of his childhood fields. To learn was to leave. To leave was to step into a world that felt louder, brighter, and far less forgiving. In classrooms far from home, books replaced birdsong, and voices argued where once there had only been ritual. Here, success was no longer measured by seasons, but by intellect, by discipline, by how well one could rise above the many. He absorbed knowledge quietly, the way dry soil drinks rain. History, politics, poetry. All of it flowed through him with the same steady patience he had learned as a child. But the stories that settled the deepest were not the ones about kings and empires. They were the ones that spoke of injustice, of imbalance, of a world divided between those who possessed everything and those who carried nothing. The idea hurt in a new way, sharp and seductive. For the first time, he began to see suffering not as fate, but as offense. Not as condition, but as crime. The calm rhythms of his childhood now felt fragile, even dishonest. How could peace exist, he wondered, when so many lived without it? And once a question like that takes hold, it rarely releases its grip. Distance changed him. The farther he traveled from the village, the more the boy beneath the mango trees seemed to fade into a memory he rarely visited. He learned to shape his thoughts with precision. He learned how words could be sharpened into conviction. He learned how silence could command a room just as powerfully as sound. Still, there was no sudden break. No single moment where everything turned. The transformation came the way water wears down stone, slowly, patiently, without ever appearing to hurry. France brought with it a new world entirely. Cold streets, gray skies, voices that debated revolution as if it were poetry. Here, ideas did not drift softly. They collided, burned, demanded allegiance. Marxism, equality, absolute justice. These concepts moved through student gatherings with the heat of prophecy. They promised a future scrubbed clean of cruelty, a world where no one stood above another. To a young man shaped by quiet observation and growing discontent, it felt less like a theory and more like a calling. Yet beneath the language of hope lived something colder. Certainty began to settle in his heart. Not the gentle certainty of faith, but the rigid kind that allows no shadows. He learned to divide the world not into complicated human stories, but into simple categories of right and wrong, pure and corrupted. And when the world is seen that way, cruelty can wear the mask of duty. Late at night, in rooms thick with cigarette smoke and restless ambition, plans were whispered with reverence. Cambodia, still far away in distance but always near in thought, became a blank page to be rewritten. The past, they believed, was the disease. The future would be the cure. When Saloth Sar finally returned to his homeland, he did not come back as the boy who once listened to monks at dawn. He returned as a man carrying a vision quiet enough to pass unnoticed at first, a vision that would, in time, demand everything. And so, as the night deepened and the stars held their distant watch, the first true steps toward an unforgivable destiny were being taken. Not with violence, not with rage, but with belief. A soft belief can be the most dangerous thing of all. The return to Cambodia did not arrive with celebration or ceremony. It arrived quietly, like a shadow slipping back into familiar streets. The air was warmer than the European cold he had left behind, thick with dust and memory. The scent of rice fields still drifted on the wind, but now it carried something else too. Unease, uncertainty. A nation holding its breath without knowing why. Saloth Sar walked these roads as a different man than the one who had left. His voice was softer, his movements more deliberate. The boy of the village had learned how to disappear inside a room, how to be present without being visible. And this skill, more than any slogan or speech, would soon become one of his greatest sources of power. He began as a teacher, a simple role, a trusted one. In classrooms filled with restless young faces, he spoke not only of lessons from books, but of lessons about the world, about fairness, about dignity, about the quiet injustice that shaped everyday life. His words were slow and measured, never loud, never rushed. He did not sound like a revolutionary. He sounded like a man who understood suffering and wanted to name it gently. And because of this, people listened without fear. Beyond the classroom, the country itself was shifting. Cambodia was caught between forces it did not fully control. Foreign wars brushing against its borders, old royal power trying to hold its shape, and new ideas pressing inward like a rising tide. In villages and cities alike, people spoke in lowered tones. Change felt close, even if no one could yet describe its face. In this uncertainty, movements grew best in the dark, and secrecy became a shield as much as a weapon. Saloth Sar slipped into the underground with the same quiet discipline he had learned as a child. Meetings were held at night, in hidden rooms lit by weak bulbs and guarded by silence. Names dissolved into code. Faces became less important than loyalty. The revolution did not announce itself with banners. It taught its followers to wait, to endure, to prepare. What began as whispered belief hardened slowly into law inside these hidden circles. The enemy was no longer just poverty or injustice. It became corruption, a word elastic enough to stretch around anyone who stood in the way. And as that word grew larger, so did the permission it gave. Step by step, compassion narrowed until only purpose remained. Yet even then, the man at the center of it all remained distant. Others delivered the fiery speeches. Others shouted the slogans. He listened, He watched. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words settled heavily, like stones dropped into still water. In that stillness, his authority grew. War soon followed, not as a clean line between good and evil, but as a spreading confusion that swallowed farmers, students, soldiers, and children alike. Bombs fell from foreign skies. Villages burned. Families fled with nothing but memory and fear in their hands. The countryside turned into a theater of survival, where every path felt dangerous, and every night carried the question of whether morning would come. In chaos, people searched for order. The movement promised order, promised an end to the suffering that had no clear source, promised a world without exploitation, without hunger, without humiliation. For many who had lost everything, that promise felt like the last remaining shelter. And so the ranks swelled, filled with the desperate and the devoted alike. As the months stretched into years, the leader who was once a shadow began to solidify into a symbol. The name Pol Pot drifted through the movement like a quiet current beneath the surface. Few outside the inner circle ever saw him clearly. Fewer still truly understood him. But his decisions shaped everything. The path was being carved long before the world noticed the direction in which it ran. And then, almost without warning, the gates of the capital fell open. Phnom Penh, once alive with traffic and voices, awoke to soldiers stepping through its streets with calm precision. There was no great battle inside the city, only the steady dismantling of everyday life. Orders were issued in level tones. Everyone was told to leave. Not for long, they were promised. Just a few days, just until things were settled. The sick were pushed onto the roads beside the healthy. Children clutched at their mothers' hands. Elders leaned on sticks as they walked beneath an unforgiving sun. The city emptied not with screams, but with confusion. Hospitals were abandoned. Schools fell silent. Homes were left exactly as they were. Meals half-cooked, doors unlocked, toys still resting in corners. Time seemed to pause inside those empty rooms, waiting for people who would never return. This was the first breath of what would soon be called Year Zero. The past, it was declared, had failed. The old world was rotten beyond repair. The new world would be built from nothing. No money, no property, no families as they had once existed. Only labor, only obedience, only the vision. Across the countryside, work camps rose where villages once stood. People were renamed as comrades. Their former identities folded neatly into silence. Teachers hid their education. Doctors concealed their skills. Even wearing glasses could invite suspicion. Knowledge itself had become a threat. Days blurred into endless cycles of labor beneath the open sky. Rice fields stretched outward like pale green oceans, demanding blood and sweat in equal measure. Hunger moved through every camp like a slow animal, gnawing at bones, clouding thought, dimming hope. And yet the rules tightened with each passing month. To complain was to vanish. To question was to be erased. Some still believed. Others pretended. Many simply endured. And through it all, the figure of Pol Pot remained distant, wrapped in secrecy so thick it almost felt like myth. He was less a man than an idea now, untouchable, unseen, unquestioned. In his absence, his will traveled freely. At night, when exhaustion pressed heavier than fear, people would lie on the bare earth and stare at stars that seemed impossibly far away. They whispered prayers not for justice, not even for rescue, but for sleep, for the brief mercy of forgetting. And in those quiet hours, beneath the vast indifferent sky, Cambodia began to understand that this was not a storm that would pass quickly. This was a season of darkness that would measure itself in years and in bones. And so, as the night deepened and the road forward narrowed into shadow, the nation stepped fully into the long silence that would define its suffering. The silence of the new world did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like fine dust drifting down after a distant collapse. At first there were still voices, still murmurs of disbelief, and quiet questions passed between workers as they bent over the fields. People asked how long this would last. Days perhaps, weeks at most. They told themselves that no revolution could demand more than that. Hope survived in those early whispers, fragile but alive. But time did not soften the rules. To sharpen them, the rhythm of each day became a narrow corridor with no doors. Before the sun broke the horizon, bodies were already moving, pulled from shallow sleep by commands that needed no shouting. Hunger changed the way people walked, the way they breathed, the way they thought. Even memory began to feel heavy, like a luxury the body could no longer afford to carry. Parents learned to hide their fear from their children. Children learned not to ask questions. Love did not disappear, but it learned how to survive in glances instead of touch. The revolution stripped people of their past piece by piece. Names were replaced with numbers. Family ties were quietly discouraged, then forbidden. The idea was simple and cruel: loyalty must belong only to the system. Even affection was treated as a weakness that could fracture discipline. And so, slowly, the most human instincts were trained into silence. Some still believed the suffering had meaning, that this pain was the labor of a better future. They worked longer, spoke less, endured more. Others felt belief slip away like water through their fingers, leaving only survival behind. And survival, when it stands alone, becomes a small and lonely thing. Rumors traveled faster than truth. People whispered of camps where no one returned, of fields that swallowed men at night and gave back nothing by morning. Fear began to live not only in what was seen, but in what was imagined. Every order now carried two meanings: the one spoken aloud, and the one that waited below it like a blade under cloth. The greatest weapon was uncertainty. By the time many understood the nature of what had taken hold of their country, escape was no longer possible. Borders were sealed by jungle, by armed patrols, by the crushing exhaustion that made even the idea of flight feel impossible. The earth itself seemed to hold them in place. Far from the fields where bodies bent in silence, Pol Pot remained hidden within layers of command. He spoke of purity, of enemies lurking in thought as much as in action. The obsession with betrayal grew until even loyalty was no longer safe. To be trusted was to be watched. To be praised was to be tested. Paranoia became policy. The movement began to consume its own, the way fire devours whatever stands closest. Former allies were accused of disloyalty. Confessions were extracted in ways that twisted truth until it lost all shape. Once named an enemy, innocence carried no weight. Each accusation fed the next, until the system no longer required real traitors in order to function. Created them as needed. In hidden prisons, history reached one of its darkest chambers. Men and women were brought in with blindfolded eyes and trembling hands. They were asked to admit to crimes they did not understand. The rooms were small. The light was harsh. The hours had no mercy. Broken bodies produced broken words, and those words were written down as proof of guilt. The process was cold, mechanical, and endless. Outside, life continued in the fields beneath open skies, as if two worlds existed side by side without touching. Birds still crossed the air. Rain still fell. Crops still pushed through the soil. Nature did not pause for human suffering. And in that quiet indifference, the cruelty felt even heavier. High-intensity moments came not with explosions, but with sudden disappearances. A person would be beside you one evening and gone by morning. No explanation followed. Their absence itself became the warning. People learned to erase people with their eyes. After each wave of fear, there would be a lull. A strange, aching calm. During these pauses, the heart tried to rest even while the mind remained alert. These were the moments when grief wandered through people in slow, silent currents. A 30-second memory could feel like a crime. A face recalled too clearly could invite tears that had nowhere safe to fall. And so grief learned how to hide inside the body, in the hollow of the chest, in the tightness of the throat, in the quiet ache behind the eyes that never fully went away. Pol Pot's voice reached the people only through layered command, softened and sharpened as it passed through hands that carried it forward. He spoke of enemies who hid everywhere, even within families. The idea took root like poison in fertile soil. Suspicion crept between parents and children. Trust thinned. Fear became the most loyal companion of all. And still, the leader himself remained distant, protected by invisibility. His presence was felt everywhere and seen almost nowhere. It allowed the vision to grow without a face, making it harder to challenge, harder to name. As months bled into years, the word temporary vanished from language. The system was no longer a transition. It was the world. Yet beneath even the heaviest silence, the human spirit did not fully disappear. In stolen moments, people shared grains of rice. In passing glances, they shared courage. In the careful teaching of a child how to count on hidden fingers, they shared the future in pieces small enough to survive. These acts did not stop the suffering, but they refused to let it have the final word. And far away, beyond the borders sealed by fear, the world was slowly beginning to turn its eyes toward Cambodia. Reports moved through distant halls. Whispers of mass death reached foreign ears. At first they were doubted. Then they were debated. Then, at last, they were feared. But inside the country, fear had already become the air itself. And so, as the night deepened and the weight of the unremembered pressed against every waking breath, the machine that Pol Pot had built continued to turn, quietly, endlessly, feeding on bodies and belief alike. And in the darkness just ahead, something was beginning to shift. Beyond the borders, where the air carried different news and different fears, the world began to sense that something vast and terrible was unfolding in the quiet heart of Southeast Asia. At first, the stories arrived as fragments, carried by refugees who crossed rivers under moonlight and walked through jungles with torn feet and empty hands. They spoke of cities drained of life, of children laboring beside elders in endless fields, of prisons where names dissolved into confessions that no longer belonged to truth. Many who heard these accounts struggled to believe them. The scale felt too large, the cruelty too without reason. And yet, the stories kept coming, each one heavier than the last. Inside Cambodia, those who still listened for distant change could feel it only as a faint pressure in the air, like the shift before a storm that never quite breaks. The work continued, the hunger continued, the disappearances continued, but something subtle had begun to weaken at the edges of the system. The revolution had promised strength through purity, but purity demanded constant cleansing. And every cleansing thinned the ranks of those who still understood how the machine truly worked. Leadership became increasingly consumed by fear of betrayal. The idea of a hidden enemy grew so wide that it began to swallow even the most devoted. No position felt safe. No history could protect anyone from suspicion. A single word spoken in the wrong tone could open the door to accusation. The obsession no longer searched only for dissent. It searched for proof that dissent existed everywhere. And under this narrowing gaze, the revolution began to fold inward on itself. Pol Pot himself grew more isolated as the years passed. Surrounded by guards, advisors, and layers of secrecy, he lived at a distance from the daily suffering he had unleashed. Reports came to him not as cries but as numbers, as abstract confirmations that the work was being done. In that distance, responsibility grew blurred. The millions of individual lives merged into a single idea of progress, and progress was a language that did not require faces. Yet history has a way of pressing inward, no matter how tightly one tries to seal it out. In neighboring Vietnam, the war had its own momentum, its own tides of destruction and survival. Borders that once felt fixed began to tremble. Old alliances shifted. New tensions rose. The Khmer Rouge leadership, already fractured by paranoia, felt that pressure as a threat not only from outside, but from within. Every external move was interpreted as proof of internal betrayal. And so the purges deepened. The prisons filled faster than the fields could absorb. Confessions became more desperate, more tangled, more detached from reality. Each forced admission created new names, new enemies, new reasons to destroy. The system no longer needed evidence. It needed only momentum. And momentum, once it learns to feed on fear, rarely slows on its own. For the people still trapped inside the labor camps, the outside world seemed like a distant dream that did not belong to them anymore. Stars still rose at night. Rain still fell on exhausted backs. Children still grew taller in clothes that never changed. But time itself felt strange. as though it moved forward without promise or destination. Birth and death occurred quietly, often unnoticed beyond the narrow circle that felt their absence or arrival. High-intensity moments still came without warning. A truck would arrive at night. Names would be called. The chosen would stand up slowly, already understanding what words would never explain. Afterward, there would be the familiar 30 or 40 breaths of numbness that followed fear, the dull calm that came when the mind could no longer expand its terror. People would return to their places. The fields would receive their footsteps again. The work would continue. And yet, something fragile and stubborn survived beneath it all. A mother taught her child to whisper a lullaby she barely remembered from her own youth. A friend shared half a spoon of rice on a night when hunger pressed hardest. A man dug a shallow grave for a stranger with unexpected tenderness, as if dignity itself were a small rebellion he could still afford. These quiet acts did not change the system, but they changed the meaning of endurance. As foreign pressure mounted and internal trust collapsed, the leadership began to fracture. Commands contradicted one another. Regions interpreted orders differently. Some carried out purges with rising zeal. Others hesitated, even if only for a moment. In that hesitation, the system revealed its first visible cracks. Meanwhile, Vietnamese forces advanced steadily toward the borders, driven by conflict that had outgrown ideology and become a war of survival and control. For Cambodia's leaders, the invasion felt like both an external enemy and the confirmation of every paranoid fear they had cultivated. The imagined traitors had become real, and the real ones were indistinguishable from the imagined. For ordinary people, the approaching war carried a strange and painful mixture of terror and fragile hope. War meant more death, more displacement, more uncertainty, but it also carried the whisper of an ending. And after years of endless routine suffering, even the idea of an ending felt like a distant light. When the invasion finally came, it did not arrive as a clean liberation. It arrived as chaos layered onto chaos. Battles tore through regions already hollowed by famine and fear. Camps scattered. Command structures collapsed. Some leaders fled deeper into the jungle. Others were captured. Many simply vanished into the confusion without names, without records, without witnesses. Phnom Penh fell again. This time not into empty quiet, but into exhausted relief tangled with fresh grief. Survivors moved back into a city that felt like a ghost of itself. Homes stood where families no longer existed. Schools waited for teachers who would never return. The shell of the old world was still standing, but its heart had been shattered. Pol Pot did not fall with his capital. He slipped back into the shadows of the jungle, carrying with him the fragments of a power that had once shaped an entire nation. For years after, he would drift across borders and alliances, a figure both hunted and hidden, protected by geography, politics, and the long hesitations of international justice. Inside Cambodia, the slow work of surviving the aftermath began. People searched for relatives in hospitals, in camps, in empty streets where only memory answered their calls. Many searches ended without closure. Bones surfaced in the soil where crops were planted. Names were spoken again for the first time in years, sometimes only in whispers, as if they were still forbidden. Grief arrived in waves, not all at once. At first, there was only exhaustion, then disbelief, then a sorrow that lived so deep it seemed to change the shape of breathing. For every story recovered, 1,000 remained untold. The land itself had become a quiet archive of loss. And yet, as the first fragile steps toward rebuilding began, something else also stirred. The question of accountability. The man who had once moved like a ghost through rooms of power now lived like a ghost moving through history. His presence felt but rarely touched. The world debated what justice should look like for a crime that had no easy measure. Years would pass before that debate found a courtroom. And in those years, memory had to carry the weight that law could not yet hold. And so, as night deepened again over a nation relearning the sound of its own heartbeat, the story of Pol Pot's fall moved into a long, uncertain twilight, one where silence no longer meant obedience, but waiting. Waiting for truth, waiting for reckoning, waiting for time to name what had been done. In the years that followed the fall of the capital, Cambodia moved as if waking from a long, terrible dream. The light felt unfamiliar. The sounds of ordinary life, voices in markets, footsteps in schoolyards, the soft clatter of daily work, returned slowly, like memories that were not yet trusted. Survivors walked among the ruins of what once was, learning how to inhabit a world that no longer matched the shape of their grief. Many carried the ache of unanswered questions inside them, questions that followed them like shadows at noon. Where Pol Pot had gone became a quiet rumor that drifted through conversations without ever settling. Some said he was deep in the jungle. Others said he had crossed borders under new protection. To many, his continued absence felt like a wound that refused to close. Justice, so long delayed, felt as distant as peace once had. For those who had lost everything, the idea that the architect of so much suffering still breathed felt almost unreal, as if the world itself had made a mistake and did not know how to correct it. Rebuilding did not begin with grand plans or sweeping change. It began with hands clearing debris from doorways. It began with rice planted into soil that still held bone beneath its surface. It began with children learning to speak again without fear. Each small act of ordinary life felt like a quiet declaration that the future, fragile as it was, still belonged to the living. Yet the past did not loosen its grip easily. Night after night, memories returned uninvited. The sound of footsteps in darkness, the low rumble of trucks, the sudden absence of someone who had been beside you only hours before. Sleep itself became complicated, no longer the simple mercy it once was, but a place where the mind wandered through old corridors of terror. People learned to live with shadows inside them, to breathe through the tightness in their chests, to carry grief as one carries an old injury, always present, sometimes unbearable, sometimes quiet enough to forget for a moment. Far away in the jungle borderlands, Pol Pot lived out his final years largely unseen by the world he had once commanded. Age bent his body as power once had bent nations. Illness crept into his bones. The man who had reshaped time into year zero now lived in a strange exile from history itself, guarded by fragments of loyalty that had survived the collapse. Even here, in hiding, control lingered in small ways, over those who still followed, over the story of himself that he allowed to be told. Then, without a courtroom, without a verdict spoken aloud for the world to hear, the story reached its quiet end. In 1998, Pol Pot died in his sleep. There was no dramatic fall, no public reckoning in his final breath, just a body that had finally surrendered to time. For some, the news arrived like a dull shock. For others, like a bitter disappointment. Many had waited for justice in the form of a trial, a confession, a naming of every stolen life. Instead, there was only the slow closing of a chapter that felt unfinished. The world reacted with a strange mixture of relief and unresolved hunger. Relief that the man himself could do no more harm. Hunger for a justice that death could not satisfy. And yet, even as his body returned to dust, the story of his actions did not follow him into silence. It lingered in the soil, in the families, in the questions that would not rest. Years later, the long-delayed trials of surviving leaders finally began. In careful courtrooms far from the farms and prisons where suffering had unfolded, witnesses spoke into microphones with voices that trembled but did not break. They spoke of brothers lost, of mothers taken, of childhoods that ended too early and never found their way back. The language of law tried to carry the weight of unimaginable pain, and sometimes it succeeded, and sometimes it fell short. But even imperfection was a form of recognition. It was a way of saying, at last, that what had happened would not remain unnamed. For survivors, justice did not arrive as a single moment. Came in pieces, in the acknowledgement of truth, in the return of stolen stories, in the shared silence that followed testimony too heavy for words. Came slowly, unevenly, but it came. Cambodia itself continued its long work of stitching life back together. Roads were rebuilt. Schools reopened. New generations grew up hearing the old stories not as lived memory, but as careful warning. The country learned how to speak of its wounds without falling entirely into them. Pain did not vanish, but it found new places to rest. And what of the boy beneath the mango trees? That child still lived somewhere in this story, preserved only in the echoes of a life that once held gentleness. His journey from quiet village to hidden dictator now stands as one of history's most haunting transformations. A reminder that darkness does not always announce itself with violence at the beginning. Sometimes it grows quietly, fed by certainty, protected by belief, and allowed to mature behind closed doors. Tonight, as this chapter draws to its soft pause, we sit with that understanding. That evil is rarely born loud. That it often arrives wearing the language of hope. That the most unforgivable acts are sometimes carried out by voices that speak calmly and hands that do not tremble. And yet, alongside that truth, another one breathes just as quietly. That even in the deepest night, humanity does not disappear. It hides in whispers. It waits in memory. It survives in small, stubborn acts of kindness too gentle to be crushed. As the night deepens once more and your breathing slows again, the echoes of this story soften around us. The fall has come. The reckoning has begun. But the meaning of what was lost and what was endured is still unfolding in the living. And so, the path now curves gently toward the final chapter of this journey, where memory and meaning meet beneath the long shadow of history. The final chapter opens not with an ending, but with a quiet remembering. Memory does not rush toward closure. It circles gently, returning to places where the heart still feels unfinished. In Cambodia, the years after the fall moved forward with cautious steps, as though the land itself was learning how to trust time again. The air felt lighter in some ways, yet heavy in others. Markets filled with voices once more. But behind those voices lived stories that rarely reached the surface. Laughter returned, but it often arrived carrying something tender and fragile beneath it. For those who had survived, life became an act of balance. They learned how to hold both the present and the past without letting either one destroy the other. Some spoke openly about what they had seen. Others carried their memories like sealed letters inside their chests, unopened but never forgotten. Both ways were forms of survival. Both were forms of strength. Children were born into a world that no longer belonged to Pol Pot, yet his shadow stretched quietly across their education, their families, their unspoken fears. In classrooms, teachers chose their words with care. History was no longer just dates and leaders. It was bones in the ground. It was empty spaces in family photographs. It was the reason some grandparents fell silent when questions grew too curious. The story was told slowly, gently, so that truth would not overwhelm young hearts before they were strong enough to carry it. High intensity returned not through violence this time, but through memory. On certain days, anniversaries reopened old wounds. Memorial services filled the air with incense and whispered prayers. Survivors stood before rows of skulls, each one a silent witness that could not speak its own name. Tears came quietly. Sometimes they came years late. Sometimes they never came at all. After these moments, there was always the soft reflection that followed. The long walk home, the evening meal eaten in thoughtful silence, the slow understanding that grief does not demand constant tears to remain real. As the decades passed, the world outside Cambodia began to speak more clearly about what had happened. Books were written, films were made, trials reached their conclusions. The story became part of global memory, not just national survival. Yet for the people who lived through it, no documentary or courtroom could fully translate what it had felt like to wake each morning without knowing if the day would end. In quiet moments, some survivors would return to the places where their lives had once broken open. A former camp, now reclaimed by grass. A prison turned into a museum, its walls still holding the weight of unspoken screams. They would stand there without speaking, letting the wind move through ruins that no longer held power. In those moments, the past did not vanish, but it softened. It became something that could be faced without being fled. And somewhere within all this remembering, the name Pol Pot slowly shifted. It moved from being a presence of fear to a presence of warning, from a force that controlled life to a lesson that guarded it. His power belonged to history now. What remained was the responsibility of those who lived after him, to remember without becoming trapped, to warn without passing forward the poison of hate. For the families who never found the bodies of their loved ones, grief learned to live without graves. They remembered through stories, through birthdays that arrived without the person they were meant to celebrate, through small traditions that survived even when people did not. The missing became part of everyday life, not as absences to be solved, but as presences that quietly endured. At night, when the world grew still again, some survivors would lie awake listening to the ordinary sounds of peace. Dogs barking in the distance, rain tapping against tin roofs, children breathing in their sleep. These sounds, once unimaginable during the years of terror, became their own gentle miracle. In those moments, the contrast between past and present felt almost too large to hold. And yet, they held it, night after night, breath by breath. There is no neat ending to a story like this. No sentence that closes the wound entirely. The unforgivable life of Pol Pot does not resolve into symmetry or moral balance. It leaves behind questions that resist simple answers. How does belief turn into brutality? How does obedience erase compassion? How does a quiet boy beneath mango trees become the architect of a nation's suffering? Perhaps the answer lives not in one moment, but in the long chain of small choices that seem harmless at first. The acceptance of certainty, the willingness to divide the world into pure and impure, the quiet permission to dehumanize in the name of a future imagined as perfect. And yet, alongside that chain exists another one just as real, the chain of endurance, of whispered kindness, of hands that shared rice when there was not enough, of lullabies sung under breath so fear would not hear them, of children taught to count on hidden fingers so knowledge would not disappear from the earth. These are the quiet forces that outlast even the darkest regimes. As this final chapter leans towards stillness, we do not close with the image of a dictator, but with the image of a people who were bent but not erased, a people who learned how to walk forward while carrying the heaviest of histories behind them, a people who proved that even when time is shattered into year zero, it still finds a way to begin again. And now, as your breathing slows and the edges of wakefulness soften, let the weight of the story settle gently, not as fear, but as awareness. Let it remind you of the fragile line between belief and harm, and of the quiet power that lives in choosing compassion even when the world makes it difficult. The night grows softer now. The past loosens its grip just a little, and in the slow rhythm of this final silence, the journey of this story comes to rest, not in forgetting, but in remembering with care. The story has reached its quiet resting place now. There are no more chapters to open, no more shadows to follow forward in time. Only the soft echo of what has been remembered, and the gentle space that comes after remembering is done. If these words have walked with you through the dark and made the night feel a little less empty, let them drift with you now into rest. Let the weight of history remain on these pages, not on your breath. You have listened with care, and that is enough for this hour. If you wish, you may return another night for another whispered journey through time. Until then, let sleep come softly, let your mind grow quiet, and let peace, in its small and patient way, find you where you are.